One small change could have rewritten our entire world. History is not a straight line, but a fragile web of moments where everything balanced on a knife's edge. We are about to explore 25 of those pivotal moments, diving into the thrilling world of historical what-ifs. Each scenario we uncover could have radically reshaped everything from the languages we speak to the borders on our maps. By the end of this journey, you will see the past not as a fixed story, but as a landscape of infinite possibilities. What if a single battle had gone the other way, or one leader had made a different choice? How far back would you have to go to prevent the world you know today? What single event from the past do you believe holds the most power over our present? His early death left a void that plunged his empire into decades of civil war. But what if Alexander the Great had survived that fever in Babylon? Instead of a sudden end at 32, he would have launched his next great campaign, a massive naval expedition to conquer the Arabian Peninsula. Success there would have secured the trade routes of the known world, funneling unimaginable wealth directly into his treasury and fueling an even larger military machine. With his forces strengthened and his ambition unchecked, the next logical target was emerging in the West, the rising power of the Roman Republic. At that time, Rome was just beginning its own expansion, a local power that would have been utterly outmatched by Alexander's veteran army, a force that had already crushed the immense Persian Empire. A confrontation between the Macedonian phalanx and the Roman legion would have been one of history's most epic clashes, a single battle that could have snuffed out the Roman ascent before it truly began. The long-term implications are staggering. A longer-lived Alexander could have solidified his empire, not just conquering new lands but successfully integrating them. He was actively promoting intermarriage between his Macedonian soldiers and local populations, and he had a clear vision of a unified Greco-Persian ruling class. With another 20 or 30 years to rule, he might have forged a stable, lasting dynasty, a true Hellenistic world-state that stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River. Without the power vacuum that led to the wars of the successors, there would have been no fractured kingdoms for Rome to later pick off one by one. The entire political and cultural landscape of Europe and Asia would have been unrecognizable. Latin might never have become the language of law and science, and the architectural and philosophical foundations of Western civilization would have been built on a purely Greek model, spreading eastward instead of westward. This single life, extended by just a few years, held the power to prevent the world of Rome we know today from ever existing. Think of the knowledge that could have bloomed in the libraries of a unified Alexandrian world. The great Library of Alexandria itself, a center of learning in our timeline, would have been just one node in a vast, interconnected network of scholarship stretching from Greece to India. Freed from the constant warfare that consumed his successors, the immense wealth of this empire could have funded scientific inquiry on an unprecedented scale. Philosophers and mathematicians like Euclid and Archimedes, who did their work in our fractured world, might have collaborated directly with astronomers from Babylon and medical experts from Egypt, all sharing findings under a single, stable political roof. This fusion of Greek theoretical science with the practical knowledge and centuries of data from the East could have jump-started a scientific revolution more than 1,000 years before the Renaissance. The concept of zero, known to Mesopotamian scholars, might have been integrated into Greek mathematics far earlier, dramatically accelerating the development of calculus. Anatomical studies, no longer constrained by Roman taboos, could have advanced medicine by leaps and bounds. The very language of progress would have been different. Latin, which gave us so many scientific terms, would have remained a local dialect in Italy. Instead, the international language of law, engineering, and philosophy would have been Greek, fundamentally altering the etymological roots of nearly every modern field of study. Our entire framework for understanding the natural world, from the names of the planets to the principles of geometry, would have been built upon this Hellenistic foundation, creating a Western civilization with a profoundly different intellectual soul. Yet the dream of a single great library preserving all knowledge was shattered in our own timeline. While the fate of the Library of Alexandria is shrouded in mystery, its repeated damage and final loss represent one of history's most profound intellectual catastrophes. Imagine the scrolls that turned to ash, the unique works of philosophy, science, and literature that vanished forever. The loss was not a single event but a series of fires and conflicts over centuries, each one erasing another piece of the ancient world's collective memory. We will never know the exact number of texts destroyed, but the void they left is immeasurable. What if, against all odds, the great library had survived completely intact? What if every one of its hundreds of thousands of scrolls had been protected, copied, and passed down through the generations? Preserving that entire repository of ancient wisdom would have been like giving humanity a massive head start. The library held the works of great thinkers whose ideas were lost for over 1,000 years. The precise astronomical calculations of Aristotle, who suggested a heliocentric solar system, could have become the foundation of science instead of a forgotten curiosity. The advanced engineering designs of Archimedes, including his concepts for steam engines, might have been built upon rather than being rediscovered centuries later. Medical texts detailing surgical procedures and anatomical knowledge, suppressed or lost in our timeline, could have revolutionized healthcare, saving countless lives from diseases that plagued the medieval world. With this continuous thread of knowledge unbroken, the scientific stagnation of the Dark Ages might never have occurred. Instead of starting over from scratch during the Renaissance, scholars would have been adding to an already vast and sophisticated body of work. This could have triggered a technological revolution in what we now call the Middle Ages. The foundational ideas for everything from the telescope to the printing press were within the grasp of ancient thinkers. With the library's collective wisdom as a catalyst, these inventions might have been refined and deployed on a wide scale. Imagine seafaring ships equipped with advanced navigational tools from preserved star charts, exploring the globe centuries before Columbus. Picture complex machinery powered by steam and water, transforming agriculture and manufacturing. The very pace of human progress could have accelerated at an unimaginable rate, potentially leading to a form of modernity by the year 1000. Our world today would stand upon a scientific foundation built over 2 millennia, not just a few hundred years. The loss of the library was more than a tragedy. It was a delay that cost humanity 1,000 years of potential advancement, leaving us to wonder what genius was lost in the smoke. The fragility of knowledge stands in stark contrast to the endurance of empires. While the library's loss set back the clock on science, the fall of Rome itself shattered the political and cultural framework of the Western world. Its collapse was not a single event, but a slow unraveling over centuries, driven by economic instability, political corruption, relentless pressure from migrating tribes, and an overstretched military. But what if that unraveling had been stopped? What if the Western Roman Empire had found a way to stabilize, to reform its legions and its treasury, and endure for another 1,000 years? A perpetual Rome would have presented a unified front to the world, fundamentally altering the entire trajectory of human history. Without the power vacuum that followed Rome's fall, the period we call the Dark Ages would never have occurred. The widespread loss of literacy, the collapse of long-distance trade, and the fragmentation of Europe into countless feuding manors were all direct consequences of the imperial collapse. In this alternate reality, the Roman road system would have remained secure, its aqueducts would have kept flowing, and the administrative machinery of the state would have continued to collect taxes and enforce laws. The continuity of this centralized authority would have maintained a common European identity, built on Latin law and language, preventing the deep cultural and linguistic divides that created modern nations like France, Spain, and Italy. Latin would have remained the living language of government, science, and commerce, meaning the Romance languages we know today might never have evolved beyond regional dialects. This enduring Roman state would have faced colossal new challenges. As the centuries turned, it would have encountered the rising force of the Islamic caliphates. Instead of the piecemeal losses of territories like Spain and North Africa to separate Muslim empires, a unified Rome would have clashed with the caliphate in an epic, sustained struggle for mastery of the Mediterranean, a conflict far greater than any of the Crusades in our timeline. With its legions and naval power intact, Rome might have held its African provinces, changing the religious and cultural map of an entire continent. Meanwhile, in Europe, powerful new entities like the Frankish Empire would have found themselves boxed in, unable to rise to prominence on the ruins of a Western empire that never fell. Charlemagne's dream of a renewed Roman Empire would have been impossible because the original never went away. The ripple effects would extend across the globe. A stable, wealthy, and technologically continuous Roman Empire would have had the resources and the motive to sponsor vast expeditions of exploration. The Age of Discovery might have begun 1,000 years earlier with Roman galleys, equipped with preserved and advanced Greek sailing technology, crossing the Atlantic not for spices, but for territorial expansion and new resources. They would not have encountered a new world of disparate, vulnerable civilizations, but would have faced the established, complex societies of the Americas at their peak. The Columbian exchange of crops, animals, and diseases would have happened under entirely different circumstances, likely with less catastrophic population collapse for the indigenous peoples, who would have been dealing with a familiar, organized imperial power rather than a chaotic rush of competing European kingdoms. The entire modern era, from the languages we speak to the very map of the world, was held in the balance by the fate of a single empire. Its survival would have created a planet dominated by a single, ancient cultural force, leaving us to wonder if the constant churn of nations we know is the only path or merely the one that followed a great collapse. The survival of Rome would have created a monolithic world, but history is also shaped by catastrophic collapse. The Black Death that swept through Europe in the 14th century was already a staggering blow, killing an estimated 1 in every 3 people. The social and economic fabric of the continent tore under the strain, yet this was a recovery, however painful. Now amplify that horror tenfold. Imagine a plague so virulent and unrelenting that it did not kill a third but 9 out of every 10 people. A world where entire villages and towns were not merely thinned but completely emptied, left as silent monuments of stone and rot. This was not just a demographic crisis, it was an extinction-level event for medieval European society. The mechanisms that allowed for recovery in our timeline would have vanished. There would have been no surplus of laborers to demand higher wages and challenge the feudal system. There would have been no merchants left to restart trade networks. The few scattered survivors would have been thrown back into a primitive struggle for mere survival, utterly incapable of maintaining the complex institutions of church and state. The cornerstone of medieval life, the Christian faith, would have faced an existential crisis it could not overcome. How could a loving God permit such utter devastation? With 90% of the clergy dead, parishes empty, and monasteries decaying, the institutional church would have likely collapsed entirely. The unifying force of Christendom, already fractured, would have shattered into isolated pockets of folk belief, unable to resist the powerful, organized cultures on its borders. The vacuum left by a depopulated Europe would not have remained empty for long. From the south, the prosperous and powerful Islamic empires of the Mamluks and the Ottomans, relatively untouched by the plague's worst effects, would have found a continent ripe for settlement and conquest. Their advanced knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and architecture would have flowed into a near-empty land. From the east, the vast steppe peoples might have pushed westward into the abandoned plains of Hungary and Germany, establishing new khanates. The linguistic and religious map of the world would have been inverted. Instead of Latin-derived languages, the dominant tongues from the Atlantic to the Urals might have been Arabic and Turkic. Great mosques and madrasas would have risen where Gothic cathedrals once stood, becoming the new centers of learning and culture. This restructured world would have had no place for the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. Those movements were born from a very specific set of European circumstances, a rediscovery of classical knowledge that only mattered because there was a European society left to rediscover it. The intellectual sparks that produced figures like Leonardo da Vinci or Isaac Newton would never have been struck. The scientific revolution, the age of reason, the very concept of individual rights that shaped modern democracy, all were products of a European soil that, in this timeline, was rendered barren. The center of global power and progress would have shifted permanently and decisively to the Islamic world and the empires of Asia, leaving our modern era fundamentally unrecognizable. The world we know was balanced on the survival of just enough people to remember who they were. Europe had already felt the sting of the Mongol horde. Their lightning raids into Poland and Hungary demonstrated a military prowess that feudal Europe could not match. The death of the great Khan Ojdeh was the only reason their armies withdrew, saving a terrified continent from total conquest. But what if that summons back to Mongolia had never come? What if the tide of horsemen had simply kept flowing westward? The fragmented kingdoms of Europe, already reeling from the initial attacks, would have shattered under a sustained, full-scale invasion. The Mongols did not merely defeat armies, they systematically dismantled entire societies, replacing local rulers with their own administrators and integrating conquered lands into the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The fall of Vienna would have been inevitable, followed by the capitulation of Paris and Rome. All of Europe would have been absorbed into this vast steppe empire governed under the Pax Mongolica, a forced peace maintained by absolute power. This Mongol peace, while brutal in its enforcement, created unprecedented stability across its territories. The famed Silk Road, a network of trade routes connecting east and west, would have been secured from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Ideas and technologies would have flowed as freely as silks and spices, but the direction of that flow would have been radically different. Instead of European explorers later seeking a sea route to the riches of the East, the cultural and economic center of gravity would have remained firmly in Asia. Europe would have become a Western periphery, a source of raw materials and conscript soldiers, its destiny dictated by Khans in Karakoram or Beijing. The Renaissance, that glorious rebirth of art and learning, was a phenomenon born from the unique conditions of independent Italian city-states. Under the heavy hand of Mongol rule, those city-states would have been crushed, their wealth confiscated for the empire, and their creative spirit suppressed in favor of imperial uniformity. There would have been no Medici patrons for Leonardo da Vinci, no papal commissions for Michelangelo. The intellectual energy that fueled the scientific revolution would have been diverted, its thinkers absorbed into the Mongol administrative machine or silenced entirely. The very identity of Europe would have been rewritten. The complex tapestry of feudalism, chivalry, and Latin Christianity would have been torn apart. The Mongols were famously tolerant in matters of religion, but they demanded ultimate political loyalty to the Great Khan. The power of the Pope would have been broken, reduced to a local religious figure with no temporal authority. The constant warfare that defined medieval Europe, the very conflicts that forged nations like France and England, would have ceased, preventing the rise of the powerful, centralized monarchies that would one day spawn the age of exploration. In this world, the great voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama would never have been funded, because there would have been no competing European kingdoms with a burning desire to bypass the Mongol-controlled land routes. The world map would have remained a single, unified Eurasian landmass under one supreme authority, a continental empire so vast and enduring that the ocean-going age might have been delayed for centuries, leaving the Americas isolated for hundreds of years more. The retreat of the Mongols was not just a lucky break, it was the event that allowed a uniquely European future to unfold. The retreat of the Mongol horsemen gave Europe the breathing room it needed to eventually look outward, but that gaze across the Atlantic was one of history's most consequential turning points. In our world, the year 1492 marks the beginning of a biological and cultural exchange that remade the planet. The Columbian Exchange was a constant two-way flow of life. Horses, wheat, and smallpox traveled west, while potatoes, tomatoes, and maize traveled east. This swap of species reshaped diets, fueled population booms, and led to the tragic, devastating collapse of indigenous societies. But what if that first voyage had never found its way? What if the Americas had remained isolated from Europe for another century, or even another 500 years? Without European contact, the great civilizations of the Americas would have continued their own remarkable trajectories. The Aztec Empire, a complex and powerful state built on a lake, was a society of staggering engineering and brutal ritual. It was not a static kingdom, but a dynamic, expanding power. Left to itself, it might have consolidated its control over all of Mesoamerica, perhaps evolving into a more stable, lasting empire. Far to the south, the Inca were mastering their mountainous realm with a bureaucratic efficiency that rivaled Rome's. Their network of roads and storehouses held a vast, diverse territory together. Without the shock of Spanish conquest, these empires could have developed in ways we can scarcely conceive. The transatlantic slave trade, an institution that forcibly relocated millions of Africans and created a brutal racial hierarchy in the New World, would never have been established. The demographic map of the Americas would be entirely different, dominated by the descendants of its original inhabitants speaking a kaleidoscope of languages like Nahuatl and Quechua. The entire global economy would have been unrecognizable. Europe's rise to power was bankrolled by American silver and built on sugar and tobacco plantations. Without that immense infusion of wealth, the kingdoms of Spain, Portugal, England, and France would have remained poorer, more regional powers, forever looking east for trade rather than west for empire. The very food on your plate tells the story of this exchange. Imagine Italian cuisine without the vibrant red of the tomato, a food that originated in the Andes. Picture Ireland without the potato, or India without the chili pepper. These foods, so central to national identities today, were completely absent from those continents before 1492. Our world is a product of that single, fateful connection. Sever that thread, and you are left with a planet of two separate worlds, each developing its own technologies, its own cultures, and its own destiny, forever altering the flavor of history itself. A cold wind whipped across the English Channel in the summer of 1588, carrying the prayers of two empires. The Spanish Armada, a colossal fleet of 130 ships, was not merely a naval force, it was a crusade. King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe, aimed to depose the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I and return England to the Catholic faith, placing it firmly under his control. The plan was for this great armada to secure the Channel, allowing a Spanish army from the Netherlands to cross and invade the English coast. In our timeline, a combination of English naval cunning, skilled ship handling, and the infamous Protestant wind shattered this fleet. But what if that wind had failed to blow? What if the Spanish galleons had successfully linked with their invasion force and landed their veteran troops on English soil? The Spanish tercios were the finest infantry in the world, hardened from decades of war in the Netherlands. They would have faced an English militia, brave but poorly trained and utterly outmatched. The fall of London would have been a near certainty. Elizabeth would have been captured or executed, and the Spanish would have installed a Catholic monarch. most likely the imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots, or more directly, a Spanish regent. The consequences would have been immediate and brutal. A fierce campaign of re-Catholicization would have begun, mirroring the Spanish Inquisition. Protestant leaders would have been purged, and the Anglican Church established by Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, would have been systematically dismantled. The vibrant English Renaissance, a period of cultural flourishing that gave us William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, would have been extinguished. The theatres of London, which thrived under Elizabeth's relative tolerance, would have been shut down as dens of heresy and moral corruption. The English language itself, just beginning its great literary expansion, might have been suppressed in official and scholarly circles in favor of Latin and Spanish. With England subdued and transformed into a Catholic satellite of Spain, the entire balance of European power would have shifted irrevocably. The great rival to Spanish dominance in the Atlantic would have been eliminated before it ever truly began. The swashbuckling English sea dogs like Sir Francis Drake, who plundered Spanish treasure fleets and challenged their colonial claims, would have been hunted down. Without this persistent English pressure, Spain's treasury would have remained overflowing with New World silver, allowing it to fund its European wars indefinitely and potentially crush the Dutch rebellion in the Netherlands. This single victory would have cemented a Spanish-dominated Europe, a Catholic superstate with unparalleled global reach. The most profound change, however, would have been across the Atlantic. The rise of the British Empire, an entity that would one day rule a quarter of the world's landmass, was born from the confidence and maritime ambition that followed the defeat of the Armada. That victory forged a new English identity, a belief in their island nation's divine favor and naval destiny. Without that spark, the colonization of North America would have followed a completely different pattern. The first successful English colony at Jamestown, founded in 1607, would never have been established. The pilgrims seeking religious freedom would have found no refuge at Plymouth Rock. The eastern seaboard of what is now the United States and Canada would have likely been divided between the Spanish, pushing north from Florida, and the French, expanding south from Quebec. The English language would never have become the dominant tongue of North America. Instead, the continent would be a patchwork of Spanish and French-speaking territories with their own distinct legal systems, cultures, and alliances. The United States of America, a nation built on English political traditions like the Magna Carta and Parliament, would never have been born. The revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment that inspired its founding might have been delayed or suppressed under the absolute monarchies of Madrid and Paris. The world we know, from the global language of business to the international balance of power, was profoundly shaped by that one battle in the Channel, a fight that secured England's future and, in doing so, created the conditions for its greatest offspring. The fields of Waterloo were a sea of mud and blood, the final act of one man's epic ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte's last gamble ended with his army shattered and his empire dissolved for good. But reverse that single day's outcome. Imagine the French cavalry charges breaking through, the Imperial Guard holding the line, and the Duke of Wellington's allied army collapsing into a disorganized retreat. A French victory at Waterloo would not have been just another battle won, it would have been a political earthquake. The news would have sent the crowned heads of Europe gathered in Vienna to redraw the map, fleeing for their capitals in panic. The fragile coalition against Napoleon would have fractured, with Prussia, Austria, and Russia each suddenly more concerned with their own safety than with a united front. With his primary field army defeated, the road to Brussels would have been open, and the path to Paris suddenly secure for Napoleon. He would have returned to the French capital not as a fugitive, but as a triumphant emperor once more, his political position restored and his enemies in disarray. This second wind could have allowed him to consolidate his control, perhaps even negotiating a tense peace from a position of renewed strength. A lasting French empire under Napoleon would have frozen the political development of Europe in its tracks. The entire continent would have been organized to serve French interests, a system of satellite states and puppet kingdoms all answering to Paris. This French-dominated order would have actively suppressed the very forces that defined the 19th century, the rising tides of nationalism and unification. In the German states, the dream of a unified Germany, which was born in the wars of liberation against Napoleon, would have been strangled in its cradle. There would have been no powerful Prussian state to lead a German confederation, no Otto von Bismarck to engineer a German empire. The German people would have remained a collection of smaller, weaker states, permanently divided and under the shadow of French power. The same fate would have befallen Italy. The movement for Italian unification, the Risorgimento, drew inspiration and opportunity from the weakening of Austrian influence, a direct consequence of Napoleon's earlier campaigns and final defeat. With a powerful French empire firmly in control of the peninsula, actively preventing the rise of a rival state on its border, figures like Giuseppe Garibaldi would have found no opening. Italy would have remained a geographical expression, a patchwork of kingdoms and papal states, its people never uniting under a single flag. The very idea of the nation-state, a country defined by a shared language and culture rather than the rule of a monarch, might have been delayed for a century or more. Our modern map of Europe, with its major unified nations, is a direct product of Napoleon's ultimate failure. His victory would have created a different world entirely, one where the continent's destiny was dictated by a single, enduring imperial will from Paris. A different kind of war, one fought not for empire but for union, nearly tore a young nation in two. The American Civil War hinged on a series of desperate moments, from the failed Confederate invasion at Gettysburg to the fall of Atlanta that secured President Lincoln's re-election. But reverse just one of those moments. What if General Robert E. Lee's orders had not been lost before the Battle of Antietam, allowing his army to deliver a decisive blow? Or what if European powers like Britain and France, desperate for Southern cotton, had formally recognized the Confederacy and broken the Union blockade? A Southern victory would have permanently fractured North America. The United States of America would have been confined to the northern states, while the Confederate States of America would have solidified as an independent, slave-holding republic built on a foundation of cotton and a rigid racial hierarchy. This division would have created two nations with profoundly opposing ideologies, locked in a Cold War that could have easily turned hot again over border disputes in the Western territories. The most immediate and harrowing consequence would have been the survival and potential expansion of slavery. The institution, which was on the verge of collapse in our timeline, would have been granted a new lease on life, legally protected and economically entrenched across the South. With their independence secured, Confederate ambitions would have looked westward and southward. The ideology of manifest destiny, the belief in a divine right to expand, would have been adopted by the South to justify carving new slave states out of the American Southwest and even into the Caribbean, potentially bringing Cuba or other islands into their orbit as slave territories. This would have created a vast, powerful bloc dedicated to human bondage, fundamentally altering the moral and political landscape of the 19th century. The economic paths of the two nations would have diverged drastically. The North would have continued its rapid industrialization, but without the vast resources and markets of the South, its growth would have been stunted. The Confederacy, meanwhile, would have remained an agrarian powerhouse, its economy dangerously dependent on a single crop and resistant to the mechanization that might have undermined the need for enslaved labor. This economic dichotomy would have prevented the rise of the unified industrial giant that the United States became in our world. When the great global conflicts of the 20th century arrived, this North American division would have reshaped everything. The United States, a smaller and more isolated power, might have lacked the industrial capacity or the political will to intervene decisively in the First World War. Without the influx of American troops and supplies in 1917, the stalemate in Europe could have ended in a negotiated peace that left a victorious, militaristic German empire dominant on the continent. The Second World War might have unfolded against a completely different backdrop. A triumphant, expansionist Nazi Germany would have faced a fractured and antagonistic North America, unable to present a united front. The Confederacy, with its own history of racial segregation and a ruling class that prized states' rights over federal authority, might have found a disturbing ideological sympathy with the Nazi regime, potentially choosing neutrality or even a tactical alliance. The D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy would have been impossible without the full industrial and military might of a unified United States behind them. The entire 20th century, from the fight against fascism to the later Cold War, would have been defined by a divided and weakened North America, leaving the globe without the superpower that ultimately shaped the modern world order. The very concept of America as a beacon of democracy was a fragile idea, one that almost died on the battlefields of Virginia and Pennsylvania. A single wrong turn in Sarajevo unraveled the world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not just a political murder, it was the trigger that detonated a powder keg of interlocking alliances. The complex system of mutual defense pacts, a delicate web meant to ensure peace through deterrence, instead turned a regional conflict into a continental inferno. But what if that chauffeur had never made his fateful error? What if the Archduke's motorcade had proceeded directly, and the young assassin Gavrilo Princip never got his chance? Without that specific public provocation, the July crisis of 1914 might have fizzled out. The simmering tensions between Austria-Hungary and Serbia would have remained just that, simmering. The dominoes would not have fallen. Austria-Hungary would not have issued its brutal ultimatum to Serbia. Russia would not have mobilized its army to defend its Slavic ally. Germany would not have felt compelled to honor its blank check to Austria and declare war on Russia, and France and Britain would not have been pulled into the maelstrom. The Great War, a conflict that claimed millions of lives and shattered a generation, might have been postponed indefinitely or perhaps avoided entirely. The absence of World War I would have fundamentally altered the 20th century's political landscape. The war acted as a pressure cooker, accelerating social and political revolutions that were still in their infancy. Most significantly, the Russian Empire would not have been pushed to the brink of collapse. The immense strain of the war, the catastrophic military losses, and the crippling food shortages were the direct causes of the 1917 revolutions. Without that national trauma, the Tsar's regime, while unstable, might have endured for years longer. The Bolsheviks, a fringe radical group, would have remained just that, denied the perfect storm of chaos and popular discontent that allowed Vladimir Lenin to seize power. Communism would never have been established as a major global ideology, meaning no Soviet Union, no Iron Curtain, and no Cold War. The entire ideological struggle that defined the second half of the 20th century would simply vanish from history. Meanwhile, the old empires of Europe, already creaking under their own weight, would have been granted a new lease on life. The German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires would not have been dismembered by victorious powers. The map of Europe and the Middle East would look profoundly different. There would have been no mandate system carving up the Ottoman lands, no arbitrary creation of modern states like Iraq and Syria, and thus no seeds of future geopolitical conflict sown by those artificial borders. The harsh Treaty of Versailles, which humiliated Germany and imposed crippling reparations, would never have been written. It was the bitter resentment fostered by Versailles that provided the fertile ground for extremist movements, most notably the Nazi Party, to take root. Without the treaty's economic devastation and national shame, a figure like Adolf Hitler would likely have remained an obscure, ranting painter, his message of hate finding no popular audience. The Second World War, with its even greater horrors, would have been an unthinkable prospect, not an inevitable sequel. The 20th century, freed from the shadow of two world wars, could have been a period of prolonged, if uneasy, peace among the great powers, a continuation of the Edwardian Age's global order with all its grandeur and its deep-seated inequalities intact. The world we inherited was forged in the fires lit by that single gunshot in Sarajevo, leaving us to wonder if a different route through the city could have saved 30 million lives and spared humanity its most destructive century. A German victory in the Great War would have redrawn the map of Europe with an iron pen. Instead of the punitive Treaty of Versailles, a Central Powers peace would have been a brutal negotiation between conquerors and the defeated. France, held responsible for the war, would have been forced to cede its resource-rich industrial territories, crippling its economic power for generations. Belgium would have become a puppet state, a German gateway to the Atlantic. In the east, a vast swath of territory from the Baltic to the Black Sea would have been carved away from a defeated Russia, reorganized into a collection of satellite kingdoms and client states under the firm control of the German Kaiserreich and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This new order, often called Mitteleuropa, would have been an economic and military bloc dominated from Berlin, a continental superpower with no rival. The survival of the old empires would have frozen history in place. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, though strained, would not have been shattered into a dozen squabbling new nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, though weakened, would have retained its core territories in Anatolia and the Middle East, preventing the chaotic colonial carve-up by Britain and France that created the modern Middle East's most volatile borders. There would have been no mandate of Palestine, no Sykes-Picot agreement dividing the region, and thus no foundational grievances for the conflicts that rage there today. The most profound shift, however, would have been the path of Germany itself. Without the sting of a humiliating defeat, the myth of the stab in the back would never have been born. There would have been no crippling reparations to bankrupt the Weimar Republic, no hyperinflation that wiped out the savings of the middle class, and no burning sense of national grievance for a demagogue to exploit. The conditions that allowed Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to rise from the beer halls of Munich simply would not have existed. The 20th century would have been spared the Holocaust, the Second World War, and the 50-year shadow of the Cold War. Instead of a century defined by the clash of ideologies, we might have seen a prolonged era of German-led technocratic authoritarianism, a world where the Kaiser's flag flew from Brussels to Baghdad, and the very idea of American global leadership never came to pass. The young Adolf Hitler stood outside the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, his future hanging on a single decision. He was a failed artist, rejected twice for what the reviewers called a lack of talent, particularly in drawing the human form. This double rejection was a profound personal catastrophe, leaving him homeless, embittered, and adrift in a city rife with anti-Semitic prejudice and political extremism. That seething resentment found a new outlet, a twisted path from the artist's easel to the political podium, fueled by the rage of a dream denied. But if just one professor had seen a flicker of promise, if his application had been accepted, how different would our world be? An art student named Adolf Hitler, immersed in the techniques of perspective and color theory, would have been pulled into a completely different social circle. He would have been surrounded by bohemians, intellectuals, and fellow artists, his worldview shaped by aesthetic debates rather than the violent, conspiratorial pamphlets he devoured in men's hostels. His immense, if misguided, energy and his powerful, hypnotic skill for public speaking might have been channeled into manifestos on Cubism or fiery critiques of traditional composition. The specific, personal fury that he would later direct at entire races and nations might have dissipated in the struggle to make a living as a commercial painter or an architect. Without his singular, terrifying charisma and his fanatical will, the fledgling Nazi Party would have remained a fringe group of thugs and malcontents. There would have been no Munich beer hall putsch, no Mein Kampf written from a prison cell, and no mesmerizing rallies at Nuremberg. the party would have lacked the magnetic leader capable of uniting the various far-right factions and harnessing the German people's desperation during the Great Depression. The political vacuum of the early 1930s would have been filled by another figure, perhaps a traditional conservative or a military dictator, but no one with Hitler's unique combination of ideological obsession and tactical ruthlessness. The Holocaust, the systematic, industrial-scale murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, was not an inevitable product of German anti-Semitism. It was the direct result of one man's deeply held pathological world, being implemented with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. Without Hitler to provide the driving vision and the ultimate authority, the final solution would never have been conceived, let alone executed. The death camps of Auschwitz and Treblinka would never have been built. Millions of lives, along with their descendants and the cultural contributions they would have made, would have been preserved, fundamentally altering the demographic and intellectual landscape of the 20th century. The war in Europe itself was Hitler's war. His specific ambitions for Lebensraum, or living space in the East, and his reckless gambles like the invasion of Poland were the direct triggers for global conflict. A continent without his influence might have seen continued tension, but not the total war that consumed nations and claimed over 50 million lives. There would have been no Blitzkrieg, no Battle of Britain, and no D-Day. The map of Europe would not have been brutally redrawn by the Nazis and then frozen by the ensuing Cold War. The Soviet Union, without the colossal trauma and immense sacrifice of the Great Patriotic War, would have developed on a completely different trajectory, potentially avoiding its own brand of totalitarian excess or collapsing from internal pressures much earlier. The entire second half of the 20th century would have been a story of diplomatic maneuverings between traditional empires, not a life or death ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. Our modern world, from the existence of Israel to the very structure of the United Nations, was born from the ashes of a conflict that one rejected art student was uniquely positioned to start. His acceptance into that academy would have erased our timeline and replaced it with a peaceful, though unimaginably different, parallel century. The mushroom cloud over Hiroshima did more than end a war, it defined an era. Yet that decision was far from inevitable. Inside the highest levels of the American government in the summer of 1945, a fierce debate was raging. Some advisors, including a group of scientists, pushed for a demonstration blast on an uninhabited area to shock Japan into surrender. Military leaders like General Dwight Eisenhower expressed grave moral reservations. The alternative was a final, terrible reckoning on the Japanese home islands, a plan codenamed Operation Downfall. This was not a minor operation. It was the largest amphibious invasion ever conceived, dwarfing the D-Day landings in Normandy. The first phase, Operation Olympic, aimed at the southern island of Kyushu, was scheduled for November of 1945. It would have been met by a Japanese defense force of millions, including countless civilians armed with little more than sharpened bamboo spears, all prepared to fight to the death for their emperor. The projected casualty lists were apocalyptic. Military planners estimated upwards of 1 million American soldiers killed or wounded, with Japanese military and civilian deaths potentially reaching 10 million. The beaches would have been transformed into slaughterhouses of a scale never before seen, a grueling, island-by-island battle for the entire Japanese archipelago that might have stretched well into 1946. A world that endured Operation Downfall would have been irrevocably scarred. Japan itself would have been utterly devastated, not by atomic fire, but by conventional explosives, artillery, and urban warfare that left every city in ruins. The human cost would have been a deep, lasting trauma for both nations, far beyond the acute shock of the atomic bombs, and the war's end would have come not with a Japanese surrender to a single power, but through a joint invasion. Soviet forces, who had already declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, would have pushed into the northern island of Hokkaido. the result would have been a partitioned Japan divided like Korea or Germany. The northern island would have become a communist Soviet satellite state, while the south would have been an American-occupied capitalist democracy. This divided Japan would have become the hottest front in the Cold War, with two hostile Japanese states facing each other across a militarized border, each a puppet of their superpower sponsor. The entire strategic balance of Asia would have been upended, but the most profound change would have been to humanity's relationship with its own destructive power. In our timeline, the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki created an immediate and terrifying taboo against nuclear weapons. Their use established a line that for 80 years no nation has dared to cross. In a world where Operation Downfall was the war's final chapter, that line would never have been drawn. The bomb would have remained a theoretical terror, an untested monster in the basement. The world would have entered the Cold War without the visceral, demonstrated proof of what nuclear weapons could do. Would the Cuban Missile Crisis have de-escalated so quickly if no one had ever seen a city vaporized? Would the doctrine of mutually assured destruction have held the same power if nuclear arms were just another weapon in the arsenal, their true potential unknown? It is possible that without the shocking demonstration of 1945, the first nuclear war might not have been a fear but a reality. The choice to use the bomb, for all its moral complexity, created a world that understood the stakes of the nuclear age in the most brutal way possible. 13 days in October held the entire world hostage. Inside the White House and the Kremlin, a single miscommunication, one moment of pride or panic, could have unleashed the unthinkable. The standoff over Soviet missiles in Cuba was not a slow-burning crisis. It was a high-stakes poker game with nuclear weapons already on the table. American warships had established a quarantine line around Cuba, while Soviet submarines, some carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes, moved into position beneath the waves. The trigger was almost pulled when a U.S. destroyer, unaware of the secret orders from Moscow, began dropping practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine to force it to surface. Down in the crushing darkness, the submarine's captain, cut off from communications and believing war had already begun, gave the order to prepare the nuclear torpedo. It was only the vehement objection of one other officer, Vasily Arkhipov, that prevented its launch. His was the single vote that averted a nuclear strike that would have certainly triggered an immediate, all-out American retaliation. But what if that one man had agreed? What if the order had been confirmed? The first nuclear weapon fired in anger since Nagasaki would have erupted in the Caribbean, vaporizing an American warship and its entire crew. There would have been no turning back. President Kennedy, under immense pressure from his military advisors, would have had no choice but to authorize a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Soviet troops on the island, authorized to use tactical nuclear weapons to defend themselves, would have launched their short-range warheads at the invading fleet and the staging grounds in Florida. In minutes, Miami and Tampa would have become smoking ruins. This localized nuclear exchange would have been the spark that ignited the global stockpile. The full strategic arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union would have been unleashed. From silos in the American heartland and from submarines lurking in the Arctic, thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles would have arced through the atmosphere, their trajectories set for cities and military bases across North America, Europe, and Asia. There was no meaningful defense against such an attack. Within a single hour, the great cities of human civilization would have been systematically erased. New York, Washington, Moscow, London, Paris, Beijing, all would have been consumed by fireballs hotter than the surface of the sun. The immediate death toll would have been in the hundreds of millions, but that was only the beginning. The vast fires would have lofted immense quantities of soot and ash into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight across the entire planet. This is the phenomenon known as nuclear winter. Global temperatures would have plummeted, creating a years-long artificial winter that would have killed harvests and collapsed the entire food chain. The survivors of the initial blasts would have faced a slow, agonizing death from starvation, radiation sickness, and the complete breakdown of society. There would have been no rescue, no organized recovery. The few pockets of humanity left would have been thrown back into a primitive struggle for survival in a frozen, poisoned world. Modern civilization, and potentially the human species itself, would have been brought to the brink of extinction. The world we live in today was balanced on the calm judgment of one man in a submerged steel tube. His decision did not just prevent a war, it preserved the very possibility of a future. The thin metal of the lunar module creaked under strains it was never designed to bear. A single misaligned switch, a short circuit in the guidance computer, or a boulder hidden in the dust could have turned humanity's greatest leap into a silent, airless tomb. The world held its breath not just for success, but for the very real possibility of catastrophe. Neil Armstrong's famous words were nearly a eulogy, his voice forever lost in the void as the Eagle crashed or missed its landing site entirely. In that moment, the entire narrative of the space race would have shattered. Instead of a triumphant broadcast from the moon, the networks would have carried a grim-faced presidential address. The American spirit, so buoyed by the can-do optimism of the 1960s, would have been dealt a psychic blow from which it might never have recovered. The profound national grief would have quickly curdled into bitter recrimination. Politicians and the public would have demanded answers, launching investigations to find who to blame for the very public deaths of two national heroes. The immense political will and colossal funding for the Apollo program, already a subject of debate, would have evaporated overnight. Congress would have almost certainly cancelled the remaining moon missions, viewing them not as a noble quest but as a reckless, expensive failure. With American ambition grounded, the torch of space exploration would have passed by default to the Soviet Union. They had already achieved a string of firsts, and while their own lunar program was deeply troubled, the absence of an American competitor would have given them the time and political space to regroup. A Soviet cosmonaut planting the red flag on the lunar surface would have been the ultimate Cold War propaganda victory, a powerful symbol that the future belonged to their system, not to democracy. This perceived technological and ideological defeat would have reshaped global alliances, emboldening Soviet influence for a generation. The ripple effects would have reached far beyond geopolitics. The entire culture of science and engineering in the United States would have been wounded. The generation of students inspired to become scientists and astronauts by Apollo's success might have chosen different paths. The technological spin-offs that emerged from the space program, from advanced computing to medical imaging and cordless tools, could have been delayed for decades or developed in a completely different context. Most profoundly, our relationship with the cosmos would have been forever altered. The iconic image of Earthrise, a beautiful blue marble hanging in the blackness, gave us a new perspective on our own planet, fueling the environmental movement and a sense of global unity. Without that vision, our sense of ourselves might have remained more provincial, more earthbound. The failure of Apollo 11 would have taught a terrible lesson that the stars were not our destiny but a fatal trap. The momentum for human spaceflight could have stalled for 50 years or more, leaving the moon untouched and the dream of Mars as pure science fiction. We came within a heartbeat of that darker timeline, a world where we looked up at the moon not with wonder but with a reminder of our own tragic limitations. The digital world we inhabit today was born from a single, top-secret military project. In the late 1960s, the United States Department of Defense created ARPANET, a decentralized network designed to ensure robust communication could survive a nuclear attack. This small network of university computers, linking just 4 locations, was the fragile seed from which our global internet would eventually grow. But what if that seed had never been planted? What if the funding for ARPANET had been denied or its architects had pursued a different, closed system? The digital revolution as we know it would have been stillborn. The personal computer might have remained a niche tool for hobbyists and businesses, never evolving into the central hub of our social and professional lives. There would have been no World Wide Web, no instant messaging, no streaming services. Our daily routines would be locked firmly in the analog patterns of the late 20th century. Imagine needing to visit a library for every piece of information, rather than pulling a device from your pocket. Communication with someone overseas would mean expensive long-distance phone calls or letters that took weeks to arrive, drastically slowing the pace of both personal connection and international business. Globalization, the intricate interlinking of the world's economies and cultures, would have been dramatically slowed. The internet acted as the great accelerator, enabling real-time financial trading, seamless supply chain management, and the rise of multinational corporations with a constant global presence. Without it, the world would feel much larger, with national borders presenting far more significant barriers to the flow of information and commerce. The very nature of information would be different. Knowledge would remain centralized, held in physical repositories like libraries, newspaper archives, and university halls. The democratizing power of the internet, which gave a global voice to anyone with a connection, would be absent. Social movements would struggle to gain traction without the ability to organize and spread their message virally. The Arab Spring, for instance, relied on social media to coordinate protests and share its story with the world. In an analog reality, such grassroots revolutions might have been isolated and easily suppressed by state-controlled media. Our economy would look completely different. E-commerce giants like Amazon would not exist. Shopping would mean a trip to a physical store for every purchase, from groceries to clothing. The gig economy, built on platforms that connect freelance workers with jobs, would be unimaginable. Banking would require standing in line at a local branch during business hours. The entire concept of remote work, which reshaped our cities and lifestyles, would be a logistical nightmare confined to a tiny fraction of jobs. The cultural loss would be equally profound. We would live in a world of scheduled entertainment, waiting for a specific time to watch a television show or listening to the radio to hear our favorite song. The vast, on-demand libraries of music, film, and literature simply would not exist. The creative explosion of user-generated content, from viral videos to independent podcasts, would never have happened. The silence would be deafening, a world where our shared experiences were still dictated by a handful of television networks and publishing houses, not by the boundless creativity of billions. We are living in the one timeline where a military experiment blossomed into a global nervous system, connecting humanity in ways its creators never dreamed possible, and leaving us to wonder about the quieter, slower, and more isolated world that almost was. The vast digital network we rely on was born from a fragile military experiment, yet another world-changing connection could have been made centuries earlier and from the opposite direction. The great treasure fleets of the Ming Dynasty were a sight beyond comprehension. Led by the Admiral Zheng He, these armadas contained hundreds of ships, some of them colossal vessels 5 times the size of the wooden craft Columbus would later sail. They were floating cities of diplomacy and trade, projecting Chinese power across the Indian Ocean all the way to the coast of Africa. These expeditions were not raids, they were grand displays of imperial majesty, designed to awe foreign kingdoms into a peaceful tributary system. Then, in the 1430s, the political winds in Beijing shifted. A new faction at court, believing the voyages to be a wasteful extravagance, gained the emperor's ear. The treasure fleets were recalled, their magnificent ships left to rot in their harbors, and the records of their journeys were largely destroyed. But what if that inward turn had never happened? What if Admiral Zheng He had received continued imperial support, and his next orders were to sail not west but east across the vast Pacific? A Chinese fleet equipped with advanced navigational tools and carrying thousands of soldiers, diplomats, and scholars could have made landfall on the western shores of the Americas. They would not have encountered the scattered hunter-gatherer societies of the Caribbean, but the immense, sophisticated civilizations of the Andes and Mesoamerica. The meeting between the Ming envoy and the Inca emperor would have been a clash of two vast, orderly, and completely alien worlds. The cultural exchange would have been profound, but likely far less immediately destructive than the Spanish model. The Chinese approach was to establish tributary relationships, not to conquer and settle en masse. They would have sought to incorporate these new lands into their celestial world order, exchanging Chinese silk, porcelain, and astronomical knowledge for New World silver, potatoes, and maize. This would have created a trans-Pacific trade route centuries before the Manila galleons, funneling American wealth directly into the Ming treasury and potentially preventing the silver shortages that later crippled their economy. The most significant difference would have been biological. The great epidemics of smallpox, measles, and influenza that decimated 90% of the indigenous population in our timeline were the result of contact with Europeans, whose societies were a bubbling cauldron of domestic animal diseases. The Chinese, while not disease-free, had a different epidemiological profile. The catastrophic die-off that made conquest so easy for the Spanish might never have occurred or would have happened on a much slower, more manageable scale. This would have allowed the Aztec and Inca empires to survive the initial contact as powerful, organized states, capable of negotiating with the Chinese from a position of relative strength. They could have adopted Chinese technology like gunpowder and metallurgy to fortify their own armies, creating a hemisphere of blended Sino-American cultures. Meanwhile, from the other side of the continent, a different thread of history was also fraying. The Viking settlement at Elands-Aux Meadows in Newfoundland proved that Europeans had reached North America 500 years before Columbus. It was a small, struggling outpost, abandoned after only a few years due to the harsh climate and conflict with the indigenous peoples they called Skraelings. But what if that settlement had not been abandoned? What if a sustained flow of Norse colonists fleeing overcrowding in Greenland and Iceland had established a permanent foothold? These were not explorers who would simply leave. They were farmers and herders looking for land. A thriving Norse Vinland would have acted as a bridge, slowly introducing old-world animals like horses, cattle, and iron tools to the tribes of the northeastern woodlands, while bringing New World crops like corn back to Europe. Diseases would still have spread, but over a much longer period, allowing Native American populations to develop immunities over generations rather than being wiped out in a single, horrific wave. By the time any later European powers arrived, they would have found not a pristine wilderness, but a connected and technologically enhanced continent, its peoples accustomed to dealing with foreigners and armed with new technologies. The Americas would never have been a new world waiting for conquest, but a complex, developed network of societies integrated into a global exchange that began not in 1492, but centuries earlier. The world we know was shaped by the isolation of these continents, an isolation that was far more fragile than it seemed. The clatter of looms in 18th century Britain echoes as the birthplace of our modern world, but that sound could have easily originated 800 years earlier and 5,000 miles to the east. The prerequisites for an industrial revolution were all present in Song Dynasty China. This was an era of breathtaking innovation where the Chinese perfected the water-powered clock, invented movable type printing, and harnessed coal and coke for iron production on an immense scale. Their iron output in the 11th century would not be matched by Britain for another 700 years. They possessed the capital, the technical skill, the abundant natural resources, and a vast, unified internal market. They were on the very cusp, so why did the spark of industry fade in China only to ignite later in a small island nation? The answer lies not in a lack of capability, but in a divergence of social and economic structures. In Britain, a shortage of labor and high wages created a powerful incentive to replace human muscle with machines. In China, a massive population meant labor was cheap and plentiful, reducing the urgency for mechanization. Furthermore, the Chinese state, a massive, centralized bureaucracy, often viewed disruptive technological change with suspicion, prioritizing stability and agricultural taxes over the volatile potential of industry. Now reverse that single, crucial variable. What if a different emperor or a shifting economic policy had actively championed the machine? Imagine the Song dynasty's technological momentum carrying forward without interruption. The first factories would not have risen in Manchester, but along the canals of the Yangtze River Delta. The Great Age of Steam would have been pioneered by Chinese engineers, their railroads stitching together an empire already unified by a common written language and a sophisticated administrative state. This would not have been a revolution confined to one nation, but an immediate transformation of the entire Eastern world. With a millennium-long head start, East Asia would have become the undisputed, unassailable center of global power, science, and commerce. The very flow of history would have reversed. Instead of European empires carving up the world, we would have seen Chinese treasure fleets, now powered by steam and iron, establishing a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean, the coast of Africa, and eventually the Americas. They would not have come as explorers or temporary traders, but as the representatives of a hyper-advanced civilization, setting up coaling stations and trading posts that would slowly draw the entire globe into a Sino-centric economic orbit. The cultural implications are staggering. The international language of science and business would be a dialect of Chinese, not English. The foundational texts of modern thought would be based on Confucian and Taoist principles interpreted through an industrial lens, rather than on the Greek and Enlightenment philosophies that shaped the West. Our modern gadgets, from smartphones to computers, would have been designed with an aesthetic and user interface rooted in a continuous, unbroken technological tradition stretching back to the Song dynasty. The world map would be psychologically recentered, with Beijing or Kaifeng as the capital of the world, and Europe relegated to a distant, underdeveloped periphery, a source of raw materials and perhaps exotic art, but utterly irrelevant to the main currents of human progress. The Industrial Revolution, as we know it, was not an inevitable product of Western genius, but a specific alignment of circumstances that could have happened anywhere. The fact that it occurred in Britain, and not in a society that was technologically poised for it centuries earlier, is one of history's greatest accidents, an event that handed global dominance to the West for half a millennium and created the modern world as we recognize it. The crucifixion was the pivotal event that defined a faith, but what if that execution had never been ordered? If Jesus of Nazareth had lived to an old age, preaching his message of the coming kingdom of God, his movement would have remained firmly within the diverse landscape of first-century Judaism. He would have been remembered as a charismatic rabbi or a Jewish reformer, one among many, and his followers would have constituted just another sect like the Essenes or the Pharisees, debating points of law and awaiting a Messiah. Without the explosive theological core of the resurrection, the concept of a dying and rising God who offered personal salvation would never have taken root. There would have been no Saul of Tarsus, no dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, and no Apostle Paul to systematically reinterpret the teachings of Jesus for a Gentile audience. Paul's missionary journeys and his letters, which formed the bedrock of Christian theology, would never have been written. The radical idea that one did not have to first become a Jew to follow Christ was the key that unlocked the Roman world, and without it, Christianity would have remained a local affair confined to the hills of Judea. The religious vacuum left by a non-existent Christianity would have been filled by the spiritual currents already swirling through the Roman Empire. The traditional Roman pantheon, with its state-sponsored rituals, was gradually losing its hold on the populace, creating a hunger for more personal, mystical experiences. This need was met by the booming popularity of mystery cults, which promised salvation and a personal connection to the divine. The most formidable of these was Mithraism, a faith especially popular with Roman soldiers. Its rituals, including a ceremonial meal and a focus on moral purity, bore striking similarities to what would become Christian practice. In this alternate world, Mithraism, with its powerful base in the military, could have easily become the dominant religion of the Roman legions and, by extension, the state religion when Emperor Constantine sought a unifying force for his vast empire. Instead of a cross, the symbol of a slain god, the standards of Rome might have borne the image of Mithras slaying the cosmic bull. The absence of a monolithic Christian church would have fundamentally altered the political and cultural DNA of Europe. There would have been no powerful papacy in Rome to crown emperors, creating the tense duality between church and state that shaped medieval politics. The very calendar we use, numbering years from the birth of Christ, would be different. Our weekends would not be built around Sunday worship, and holidays like Christmas and Easter would not exist, their dates perhaps occupied by festivals for Sol Invictus or Isis. The immense cultural energy that went into building cathedrals, composing sacred music, and painting biblical scenes would have been directed toward other gods and other stories, leaving our art and architecture unrecognizable. Most profoundly, the great schisms and reformations that tore Europe apart were internal Christian family fights. Without a central Christian authority to rebel against, there would have been no Protestant Reformation led by Martin Luther. The subsequent wars of religion, which killed millions and redrew the map of Europe, simply never happen. The intellectual battle between faith and reason, which fueled the Enlightenment, would have taken a completely different form, as the specific doctrines of the Church would not have been there to challenge. This single execution prevented a timeline where the spiritual landscape of the West is a mosaic of competing pagan traditions, where the philosophical language is derived from Plato and Zoroaster rather than Augustine and Aquinas, and where the driving force of European expansion was not the cross but the sword and the sun god. 36 barrels of gunpowder sat in a cellar directly beneath the House of Lords. The plot was meticulously planned, the fuse was ready to be lit, and if not for that anonymous letter urging a certain lord to stay away, the explosion on November 5, 1605 would have been more than a failed memory. It would have been a decapitation of the English state. The blast would have annihilated King James I, his entire family, most of the Protestant aristocracy, and the full leadership of the government in a single, thunderous moment. In the immediate, smoke-filled aftermath, London would have plunged into absolute chaos. With no clear sovereign and the central authority vaporized, the country would have fractured. The conspirators, led by Robert Catesby, had planned for this very moment. Their goal was not mere destruction, but a political revolution to ignite a popular Catholic uprising that would place James's young daughter, Princess Elizabeth, on the throne as a Catholic puppet queen. In the power vacuum, they might have initially succeeded in seizing control of the Midlands, rallying the long-oppressed Catholic gentry to their cause. But this would not have been a peaceful transition. It would have been the first spark in a devastating civil war. Protestant England would not have lain down quietly. Military leaders and local militias loyal to the Protestant faith would have mobilized just as fiercely, turning the streets of every city and the fields of every shire into a battleground. The conflict would have been a religious war as brutal as those tearing Europe apart, a fight for the very soul of the nation. This internal weakness would have been a siren call to foreign powers. Catholic Spain, England's great rival, had long dreamed of returning the island to the fold. With England consumed by internal strife and its navy in disarray, a Spanish armada far more successful than the one sent by Philip II might have landed troops on English shores, not as invaders but as allies to the Catholic faction. Their intervention would have tipped the scales, ensuring a Catholic victory but at the cost of English sovereignty. England would have become a client state of the Spanish Empire, its foreign policy, and its religion dictated from Madrid. The long-term consequences for the emerging British Empire would have been catastrophic. The ambitious colonial projects of the 17th century were driven by Protestant England's desire to compete with Spain and France. A Catholic, Spanish-aligned England would have had no reason to challenge the colonial order. The Virginia Company, which established the first permanent English settlement in Jamestown just 2 years later, would never have received its charter. The Puritan pilgrims seeking refuge from religious persecution would have found no haven in a newly re-Catholicized England, and thus no Mayflower would have ever sailed for Plymouth Rock. The entire English colonization of North America, the foundation of the future United States, would have been stillborn. The eastern seaboard would have been left to the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish. The English language, the common law legal tradition, and the particular blend of political liberties that evolved in England would never have been planted in the New World. The United States of America, a nation born from English political thought, would simply not exist. The failure of the gunpowder plot did more than preserve a king. It secured the Protestant destiny of England and, in doing so, guaranteed the birth of its most influential offspring, a nation that would one day define the modern era. For nearly 1,000 years after Rome's fall in the West, its eastern twin endured. Constantinople was more than a city. It was a living fortress of classical civilization, its massive Theodosian walls defying every siege for centuries. Yet its final fall in 1453 to the Ottoman cannons felt like the extinguishing of a final, flickering light. Reverse that single, brutal conquest. What if those walls had held and the Byzantine Empire found a way to survive as a permanent, powerful Christian state straddling Europe and Asia? This enduring Byzantium would have acted as an unbreachable dam, holding back the tide of Ottoman expansion for generations. The relentless push into the Balkans that brought Ottoman rule to Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece would have been halted at the very gates of Constantinople. The entire religious and ethnic makeup of southeastern Europe would be unrecognizable. Nations that spent centuries under Ottoman yoke would have retained their Christian character, their histories free from the deep cultural scars of foreign domination. The dynamics of the Renaissance would have shifted profoundly. In our timeline, the flood of Greek scholars fleeing the fallen Constantinople into Italy provided a crucial spark, bringing with them precious ancient texts that fueled the rebirth of classical learning. But in a world where Byzantium stood strong, this knowledge transfer would have been a controlled, continuous exchange, not a desperate rescue mission. The great libraries of Constantinople would have remained intact and actively growing, making the city itself a primary destination for scholars, a rival to Florence and Rome. The Renaissance would not have been a rediscovery of a lost world, but a lively dialogue with a living one. We might have seen a fusion of Italian art and Byzantine theology, a blending of architectural styles that never happened. The very knowledge we had to painfully reconstruct would have been passed down in an unbroken chain. The Byzantine Empire was the direct heir to Rome's administrative genius and Greece's philosophical legacy. Its survival would have meant that the works of Plato and Aristotle, the legal codes of Justinian, and the advanced engineering feats of antiquity were never lost to the West, but were instead curated, copied, and advanced within a single, continuous imperial tradition. This would have prevented the great schism in learning that characterized the Dark Ages, creating a world where the torch of classical knowledge burned brightly without interruption. The survival of this last outpost of Rome would have changed everything from the maps of Eastern Europe to the very soul of the Enlightenment, leaving us to wonder how much brighter our collective history could have been if that final Roman candle had never been snuffed out. The cannons at Fort Sumter never fired a single shot. Instead of a call to arms, a tense and protracted negotiation produced a formal divorce between North and South, creating two rival American nations through a diplomatic agreement rather than a bloody civil war. This peaceful secession would have resulted in a continent permanently divided, a geopolitical reality far more complex than our own. The United States of America, confined to the northern states, would have been a major industrial power, but one without the vast agricultural resources and warm water ports of the South. The Confederate States of America, meanwhile, would have solidified as an independent, slave-holding republic, its economy and national identity built entirely on the institution of cotton and racial hierarchy. This division would have created a Cold War on the North American continent, a constant simmering tension over borders, tariffs, and the future of the Western territories. The most immediate ambition of this new southern nation would have been expansion. The ideology of manifest destiny would have been twisted to serve a new purpose, fueling a southern drive to create a slave empire stretching into the Caribbean and Latin America. The first target would likely have been Cuba, a Spanish colony where southern politicians had long dreamed of expanding their peculiar institution. With their independence secured and without a powerful northern neighbor to object, the Confederacy could have used its military to foment rebellion or launch a direct invasion, annexing the island as a new slave state. The next logical step would have been to push further south, projecting power into Mexico and Central America, carving out a vast tropical empire to feed the insatiable demand for cotton, sugar, and coffee. This expansionist southern power would have fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. European empires, which in our timeline were largely pushed out of the Americas by the growing might of a unified United States, would have seen a golden opportunity. A divided North America is a weak North America. Great Britain and France, both with economic interests in the South and a desire to check the power of the northern states, would have eagerly engaged in a new great game on the continent. They would have formed shifting alliances, offering the Confederacy financial and military support in exchange for favorable trade deals and political influence, effectively turning the South into a European client state. This external meddling would have prevented any chance of eventual reunification, locking in the continent's division. When the great global conflicts of the 20th century erupted, this fractured North America would have been utterly transformed. The First World War would have presented a devastating dilemma. The industrial North, with cultural and economic ties to Britain and France, would have leaned toward the Allied powers. The agrarian South, however, dependent on European trade and potentially holding sympathies for the more aristocratic, conservative structures of the Central Powers, might have declared neutrality or even entered the war on the side of Germany. Imagine a scenario where American troops are not just absent from the Western Front, but where southern ports are actively supplying German U-boats. The entire dynamic of the war shifts. Without the immense industrial capacity and fresh troops of a unified United States arriving in 1917, the stalemate in Europe could have ended with a victorious Germany, redrawing the map of the continent to its own advantage. The Second World War would have been even more chaotic. A triumphant and expansionist Nazi Germany would have looked across the Atlantic and seen not a sleeping giant, but two quarreling mid-sized powers. The Confederacy, with its own history of racial segregation and a ruling class that prized states' rights over federal authority, might have found a disturbing ideological kinship with the Nazi regime. It is chilling to consider that the Confederate States could have chosen a policy of benevolent neutrality toward the Axis, or even become a formal ally. The D-Day landings would have been an impossible fantasy without the unified industrial might and manpower of a single American superstate. The entire 20th century becomes a story of European powers exploiting a weak and divided hemisphere, a world where the beacon of democracy never shone brightly and where the very idea of America was split in two from its very beginning. A motorcade turns safely onto Elm Street, and the world continues on its expected path. President John F. Kennedy, having narrowly avoided an assassin's bullet, serves out his full second term. This single alteration would have profoundly recalibrated the entire decade. Kennedy's approach to Vietnam was one of cautious skepticism. He had already signed a directive to begin a gradual withdrawal of American military advisors, a plan scheduled to start just weeks after his death. With Kennedy still in office, that withdrawal would have likely proceeded, preventing the massive escalation of combat troops that defined the Johnson presidency. The Vietnam War, as we remember it, a conflict that tore America apart and cost over 58,000 American lives, might never have happened. Instead, the American presence would have diminished, leaving South Vietnam to its own fate much earlier and avoiding the deep national trauma that shattered public trust in its government. Domestically, the momentum for civil rights would have followed a different, though still difficult, path. Kennedy had introduced the landmark Civil Rights Act, but it was stalled in Congress by powerful Southern Democrats. His survival would have kept his unique moral authority and political capital at the forefront of the fight. While he would have faced the same entrenched opposition, his continued leadership, combined with the powerful oratory of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., might have forged a different legislative compromise, perhaps passing a version of the act earlier and without the amendment. Political cost his successor incurred. The turbulent summer of 1968, marked by riots and the assassinations of King and Robert Kennedy, might have been averted, or at least its fury tempered, preserving a sense of national possibility rather than descending into cynicism and violence. The Cold War itself would have been steered by a different hand. Kennedy, forged in the crucible of the Cuban Missile Crisis, had developed a profound caution regarding direct military confrontation with the Soviets. His strategy was one of flexible response and backchannel diplomacy. It is conceivable that his continued dialogue with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev could have led to an earlier détente, a gradual thawing of tensions that might have prevented the massive arms buildup of the late 1960s and 70s. The space race would have retained its glamorous, peaceful competition aura, likely still aiming for a moon landing, but without the grim backdrop of a worsening war in Southeast Asia. Culturally, the entire mood of America would have shifted. The Kennedy aura, that blend of intellectual vigor and youthful optimism often called Camelot, would not have been frozen in time as a lost ideal. Instead, it would have been tested by the realities of a full 8-year administration. The counterculture movement, which grew in part from a rejection of the establishment over Vietnam, might have remained a more fringe element, unable to gather the same disillusioned momentum. The sound of the 60s would have been different, less defined by protest anthems and more by the complex notes of a nation navigating progress and conflict under a familiar leader. His survival would have changed more than policy. It would have altered the American soul, leaving us to wonder if the hope he inspired could have truly endured the challenges to come. The final years of the Cold War were a house of cards, a precarious balance of terror where one gust of wind could have brought it all crashing down in favor of the Soviets. For decades, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation, but a Soviet victory did not necessarily require a mushroom cloud. A different outcome could have been secured in the economic trenches where the United States faced its own vulnerabilities. A deeper, more prolonged stagflation crisis in the 1970s, coupled with a failure to innovate in computing and consumer goods, could have shattered global confidence in the dollar. If the American economy had flat out collapsed under the weight of inflation and unemployment, the model of capitalist democracy would have been utterly discredited in the eyes of the world. The Soviet Union, with its centrally planned economy appearing stable by comparison, would have been positioned as the undeniable victor without a single missile being launched. In this alternate reality, the ideological map of the planet is redrawn completely. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is not a symbol of freedom, but a moment of grim consolidation as a Soviet-led alliance absorbs a reunified Germany. The Iron Curtain does not recede, it expands, stretching across Western Europe. Nations like France and Italy, with their strong communist parties, become willing satellites, while Britain and Spain might hold out as isolated, impoverished capitalist holdouts, their influence neutered. The non-aligned nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, seeing the American dream exposed as a fantasy, would have overwhelmingly realigned their economies and political systems toward Moscow. Communism becomes the default operating system for global governance, a monolithic ideology enforced by the KGB and its international counterparts. The cultural and technological landscape of this world would be starkly utilitarian. The vibrant, chaotic explosion of American pop culture, from rock and roll to Hollywood blockbusters, is replaced by state-approved socialist realism. Artistic expression serves the revolution, and the global internet, had it developed at all, would be a tightly controlled, walled garden known as the Red Net, used for surveillance and propaganda rather than free exchange. The most visible symbol of this Soviet-dominated future would be overhead. The space race, which ended with the American flag on the moon, would have culminated with a different emblem planted in the lunar dust. The Soviet space program, having achieved the first satellite, the first animal, the first man, and the first woman in space, would have likely secured the next great prize. The first permanent space station becomes a Soviet city in the sky, and the first footprints on the moon bear the distinct pattern of a Soviet boot. Mars, rather than being a target for NASA, becomes the objective for cosmonauts, with the Red Planet serving as a fitting new frontier for the Red Empire. Our world, defined by American cultural and technological hegemony, would simply vanish, replaced by a grayer, more controlled existence where the hammer and sickle flew not just over the Kremlin, but over capitals from Washington to Paris. A flash of light outshone the sun, a silent herald of a force beyond human control. The asteroid that exploded over Chelyabinsk in 2013 was a cosmic warning shot, a relatively small rock that still injured over 1,000 people with its shockwave. But what if the next one was not a warning but a direct hit? Imagine an object just half a mile wide, a mountain of iron and stone traveling at 40,000 miles per hour, striking not an ocean or a frozen tundra, but a densely populated region like Western Europe or Southeast Asia. The immediate effects would be apocalyptic. The kinetic energy of the impact would be released in an instant, equivalent to the detonation of every nuclear weapon on Earth at once. The target zone and everything within hundreds of miles would simply vanish, replaced by a crater dozens of miles wide. The fireball would incinerate millions in a flash, while earthquakes and hurricane-force winds would flatten landscapes for thousands of miles in every direction. The immediate death toll would be in the tens of millions, a single day of destruction surpassing every war in human history combined. The true catastrophe, however, would just be beginning. The impact would vaporize billions of tons of rock and soil, lofting it high into the stratosphere along with soot from global firestorms. This thick, dark shroud would wrap the entire planet, blocking sunlight for years. This is an impact winter. Global average temperatures would plummet by 20 degrees or more, turning summer into a perpetual, sunless freeze. Agriculture would become impossible. Crops would fail from a lack of photosynthesis and killing frosts, leading to a total collapse of the global food supply. The mass starvation that followed would claim billions more lives, a slow, grinding end for the vast majority of humanity. Our complex technological civilization is built on a fragile web of just-in-time supply chains, all of which would snap. Without sunlight, solar power would fail. The dust and debris would contaminate air and water, clogging machinery and making internal combustion engines useless. The global electrical grid would collapse under the strain and lack of maintenance, plunging the world into a darkness deeper than any night. Within weeks, there would be no fuel deliveries, no food shipments, no functional hospitals, and no law enforcement. The internet, our global nervous system, would go silent forever. The survivors would be thrown back into a new stone age, but one without the knowledge of how to live off the land. They would scavenge in the ruins of a world they no longer understood, fighting for canned food in a frozen, dying landscape. All the accumulated knowledge of millennia, from the principles of medicine to the great works of art and literature, would become meaningless in a daily struggle for survival. The long-term trajectory of humanity would be irrevocably altered. The few scattered pockets of people who endured would be isolated, their numbers too small to maintain genetic diversity or complex skills. The world would slowly recover over centuries, the dust settling and the sun returning, but the civilization that once was would be gone, its cities standing as silent, rusting monuments to a species that reached for the stars but was undone by a random rock from the void. This scenario is not science fiction, it is a mathematical certainty over a long enough timeline. Our existence in a modern world is a temporary grace period between these cosmic collisions, a fragile chapter that could be closed at any moment by a visitor from the deep. 25 fragile moments, any one of which could have shattered the world we know and rebuilt it anew. We have wandered through a gallery of might-have-beens, from the survival of an emperor to the failure of a plot, from averted plagues to lost libraries. Each scenario reveals a profound truth, that our timeline is not a preordained path, but a delicate tapestry woven from countless threads of chance, accident, and individual choice. The languages we speak, the borders on our maps, the very food on our plates, all are the products of a history that did not have to be this way. We stand on a foundation of a million accidents, a precarious reality built atop a canyon of infinite possibilities. This journey is not just about the past, it is about understanding the stunning randomness of our present. It reminds us that the future, too, is a landscape of endless potential, shaped by the decisions we make today. So we turn the question to you: what single event from the tangled web of history captures your imagination? Which turning point do you believe holds the most power over our world today? Share your own favorite historical what if in the comments below, and join the conversation about the mysteries of our past. For more deep dives into the moments that almost were, be sure to subscribe.